Hi everyone, this is the last episode of this season. 6 seasons, hard to believe. Thank you for spending this time with us, exploring our dazzling natural world together. We've absolutely loved bringing you these stories, and I hope we've inspired you. We're busy making plans to bring you more episodes in the near future. In fact, we could use your help. We'd love to hear what you think of the wild. Which shows did you like the best? What would you like to hear more of? We've put a link to a survey in the show notes. If you have a moment, please fill it out. It'll really help guide us as we plan our next season. Okay, on with the episode. You've probably heard about Grizzly 399. At 28 years old, she was the oldest mother grizzly bear known in the Yellowstone area. And she was quite literally the poster child for grizzlies in North America. Mother to at least 18 cubs, 399 was known as Queen of the Tetons. Tom Mangelsen has lived in her home range in the wilds of Wyoming since the late 1970s. Tom knew this bear like very few people get to know a wild animal.
399 was literally in my backyard a number of times. One of the cubs was swimming in my pond, and the family with the 4 were eating berries on my fence. They can be very dangerous, but she showed the other side of grizzly bears quite well to millions of people, that they're also gentle and they're very attached to their young, and they have emotions just like we do.
Tom Mangelsen is one of the most gifted and prolific wildlife photographers of our time. He has followed 399's journey for decades, and he's taken a lot of photographs of her and her families over those years. He's not exactly sure, but over 1 million photos is his best guess. Tom has been on my list to interview for this show almost since I started doing this podcast. We finally made a plan to talk about 399. And then tragedy hit.
Some sad news from Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming.
Female grizzly known as number 399 was hit by a car last night.
I'm possibly one of the most famous bears in the world.
In 28 years, number 399 gave birth to 18 cubs, so she really did do her part to help restore the grizzly population that was near zero in that area in the late 1900s.
Before I could get Tom into a studio, Grizzly 399 was killed. So now, more than ever, seemed like the right time to talk to the man who knew her best. But it wasn't just the sad loss of 399 that interested me. I've spent thousands of hours alongside and guiding some of the best wildlife photographers in the world, but I've never been lucky enough to spend time in the wild with Tom. And he's always seemed to possess a connection with animals that is rare, whether it be gorillas, penguins, tigers, or our beloved grizzlies. Tom's work over the last 50 years captures moments of true nature that inspire people all over the world. I went into our conversation wanting to understand how he sees the world through his camera lens. What I got was a lesson in being still.
You have to wait. I'll say just another 10 minutes, and it'll turn into an hour or an hour and a half. But other times I've waited a bit longer than maybe the next person, and I've got the picture.
From KUOW in Seattle and Chris Morgan Wildlife, welcome to the wild.
Hi, Chris.
Hi, Tom. How are you doing?
It's snowing and icy out there, and I'm leaving for India in the morning, so I'm ready to leave, but I wish it weren't snowing.
Well, it's funny, isn't it? The hardest part of getting to India is right outside your front door.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
What are you going over for?
Tigers. You've surely been there.
I've never been to India. I spent some time in Pakistan, and I've never been to India. Never seen a tiger in the wild. Never done that, no.
You got to go.
It has really good to be with you, Tom. And it's funny, I was just doing a little bit of a dig through some old emails, and I sent you one in September 2021 from the field as I was looking for Grizzly 399. And you replied right away because you were also, of course, out there looking for 399. And you saw me in a distance, but our paths never crossed on that occasion. It always seemed like we're sort of passing in the night almost, so I'm so glad to be here with you, Tom.
Glad to be here with you too, Chris. I'm sorry we missed each other then, so you have to just come back, and we'll have to watch for 610 or one of her offspring now. So,
Tom, first, I'm so sorry for your loss, and I say that because I feel like Grizzly 399 was like family to you. Is that true?
Yes, I think I've spent almost 19 years documenting 399 and her offspring and their offspring. And I got fascinated with her. And she first arrived in Teton Park in summer of 2006, and I saw her briefly then. And I thought it'd be kind of a one-off sighting because there hadn't been any bears in Teton Park for almost 50 years because they had been extirpated by poachers and hunters and some by the Park Service. And so there were no resident grizzly bears, those that stayed and denned and hibernated, etc., in the park for a very long time. So it was a big deal. I'd had to go to Yellowstone, which was like seeing a whooping crane, or very rare even in Yellowstone. So I ended up going to Alaska, where I know you've been, Katmai Park and Denali and other places to see grizzly bears. But as things went along, I got more and more attached to 399 and her offspring, and just it wasn't anything planned, obviously, and I thought every year she might not show up, but every year she did. So it was great for me and a wonderful gift to me to see her as many times as I have and be able to film her and photograph her.
And you've done a lot of interviews about 399 over the years, and especially in this past month or so since her death. And you've said that there's no other bear like her. How are you feeling now that she's gone?
Well, it's really tough because normally this time of year I would be out every day near Pilgrim Creek, which is where her home range is, and her den is in the mountains above Pilgrim Creek in the wilderness area out of the park. But I would normally be out there now instead of going to India to photograph tigers tomorrow. So I think tigers might be a good distraction for me, and I won't be driving around Teton Park pretending to look for her, I guess.
Wow, yeah, has it made you feel a little aimless now that this special time of year is here and she's not there?
Right. I don't know what to compare it to. It's a loss of a dear friend, and before she was struck and hit and died, I had 3 old friends that actually passed, which made it even more difficult. I had 6 weeks of 3 people I knew well that passed away, and then she got killed. But I think even as good as friends as I were with my friends from Boulder that I knew for 50 years almost, her dying was just as tragic as theirs, maybe in some ways more so.
That says it all. I've wanted to talk to you for so long because I feel like we share this same obsession with bears, and especially grizzlies, and I know what it is for me, but what is it for you about grizzlies in general, beyond 399? What is it about these animals?
It's really hard to describe, as you know. I think anybody asks you what's your attraction to grizzly bears. I think I spent about 10 years on Hudson Bay, Churchill, Manitoba, photographing polar bears from mid-'80s to mid-'90s. But I think just bears in general, and polar bears are fascinating. I know you've seen them too and been with them. But 399 was basically in my backyard, and literally in my backyard a number of times. One year,
doesn't get closer.
No. Well, one year they were one of the cubs, subadults, was swimming in my pond, and the family with the quadruplets, when she had those, were eating berries on my fence, and she was pulling down branches and helping the cubs get to the top berries and things. But just sit there, top of the food chain, and they can be very dangerous. But she showed the other side of grizzly bears quite well to millions of people, that they're also gentle and they're very attached to their young, and they have emotions just like we do. When I've seen 399 lose one of her cubs 8 or 10 years ago, that the cub got run over at dusk on the highway just near the road at Pilgrim Creek, and 399 went out and picked up the body of, it was nicknamed Snowy because she had a really white face, but she picked it up in her mouth and then walked it into the woods and dropped her body by a fallen spruce tree. Then she went back to the highway and ran up and down the highway, sort of drooling and foaming at the mouth and standing up and looking and bawling like a bear bawls. And she was just frantic, as if she didn't quite register that her cub had died, which I think is similar to what when we hear somebody's died, the first thing we say, you can't believe it, right? You always say, I can't believe he died or she died or whatever. Well, she ran up and down the highway all night, just crazed. And I think that's pretty much how many people feel when we lose a dear one. When I saw that, again, it just added more knowledge to her sentience, and her emotions were quite like ours.
You mentioned sentient beings, and I've heard you say that before, and I totally agree, and it feels like you in particular have had so much time around grizzly bears, and this very special grizzly bear that became very famous, that you get to see a side of that bear that most people don't. For most people, it's a glimpse, if they're lucky, of a bear in a place, if they're lucky enough to go to Grand Teton or Yellowstone, and there's not many places in the lower 48 where you can see them. It's just usually a glimpse, but for you, it's been such immersion, and it allows you to see the individuals and their personalities, and I think it's so lost, isn't it, when we talk about wildlife and wild creatures generally. People don't look at them as individuals. And sometimes when I'm in an auditorium or a school classroom, I'll say that bears are as different as all of the people in this room are from each other. You know, it's so true, isn't it? It's part of the attraction to me, for sure, in these creatures, is that sentient being and the fact that they are all very individual, you know. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that here, but I want to go back in time a little bit to your early life. Were you obsessed with nature as a kid?
I grew up in Grand Island, Nebraska, which is a small, it was 20,000 people then. But I spent a lot of time with my dad out in the duck blind and just waiting for a flock of ducks or geese. And we'd spend the whole year preparing for the next fall. And we'd build blinds and cut willows and paint decoys or make decoys. And so I learned from my father early on that, you know, it takes a lot of time and patience, and I think that's probably the biggest thing I got from my early years. And I watched a lot of things, I observed, and you're sitting there, you know, day after day, and some days or some years maybe, you know, I was going to school, but my dad would call Monsignor Keating and ask him if the ducks were flying, ask him if I could take the day off to go hunting.
What a dad.
Yeah, but then we always gave the priest our ducks after we came back, so we kind of bribed him, I think.
That sounds like it was your introduction to your passion for nature. And did something change from hunting to something else? What happened?
Yeah, my dad was sort of a typical Midwestern man, and like most people he thought that there were sort of the good guys and bad guys. The bad guys were like coyotes and foxes and raccoons and skunks and possums.
Ever the hunter, Tom's father suggested that Tom start trapping these animals so they couldn't get into the family's duck and quail eggs. So Tom read up on trapping methods and ordered a few traps of his own.
He said, but you have to skin them, and you know you can't waste them, just kill them. And so I stayed up late at night fleshing out skins. I didn't do any skunks, but raccoons and possums, and sold them to the local furrier for $1.50 or $2.50 or $3. But anyway, during that time, I caught up. One day I was checking my traps along the riverbank, and there was just a foot in the trap and just a bloody stump. And I thought, gee, that raccoon was really desperate. He chewed his foot off to get out of the trap, and just really was like, holy crap. And then about a week later, I caught a raccoon with only 3 feet. So the raccoon came back again, went back and told my dad that I caught this 3-footed raccoon in the foot the week before or whatever. And he said, well, maybe, Tommy, we should hang up the traps. And he said, that's pretty cruel and inhumane.
The look in your face when you just talked about that raccoon when you were a kid, are you still sad about that? Do you look back at that as a turning point and something, it clearly stuck with you?
Yeah, I do. It's like it was yesterday. It was such a traumatic scene. And I had 3 raccoons as pets since that time. I learned, the raccoons are incredibly smart and fun. And this one would get in the cookie jar, and I would try to scold it because they're my cookies, right? He'd know they're my cookies, and he'd growl at me. So I just let him have the cookies.
Again, like the bears, seeing them as individuals and how intelligent they are makes it difficult to harm them. Wow, there's so much there to sort of really analyze. Do you feel in some ways that your photography, just switching to some of your photography work, is your photography work being, after experiences like that, getting to know animals as individuals, is there a little bit of therapy for you in there, in the photography?
Oh, sure. It's cliched, but I think getting out in nature and all that is always healing to most anybody that I know or am aware of. But I'm so glad I had those experiences of hunting and fishing. We have also fished a lot in the summertime. But when I was young in Ogallala, Nebraska, we spent a couple of years after Grand Island there, and I was living on a farm and a kind of rancher, and he would pay his son and I a nickel for every sparrow we shot and hide in the barn and pick them off, and we'd go collect our nickels so we could go buy another package of BBs for 10 cents.
Oh my goodness!
I can't
wow.
I can't look at an English sparrow today without thinking about it. I seriously swear to God.
Right.
And
you better be taking a lot of good photographs for these animals, Tom. Yeah.
We're at a restaurant and the sparrows come around. I always feed them, right? Just thinking I'll make up for their ancestors.
Oh,
it all affected me. It's time for payback, and that's what I'm doing now for the rest of my life, I guess.
Tom told me that he gradually grew out of killing, but he still had this deep interest in animals. So when it came time for Tom to start grad school, he contacted Paul Johnsgaard at the University of Nebraska. Professor Johnsgaard was considered a world authority on ducks, geese, and swans. And Tom wanted to be his student.
He said, bring your transcripts down, and I asked him if he'd be interested or could be a graduate advisor. And I showed him my transcripts, and he said, well, these are not really up to snuff. They were about a B+ or C- or something. I don't know. But I told him I had won the World's Goose Calling Championship twice, thinking that might be an N. That didn't impress him much. But I told him I had my family had a cabin on the Platte, and that did tweak him. And he said we do make exceptions for students. But later, when we'd do book signings together, because we collaborated on a number of books, he would say, well, Tom was probably my worst student, but one of the most successful.
The professor and Tom spent a lot of hours together in that blind.
So I spent from December until May in the duck blind counting how many drake pintails there were, how many drake mallards there were, how many green-winged teal, how many. So I can tell now, just by a silhouette at some distance, what species it is.
Tom soaked up all the information he could as he and Paul counted and observed the waterfowl.
But sitting in the duck blind and being out in the field, I always thought, well, I wish somebody was here to paint this beautiful scene. It might be a cottonwood trees and a snowstorm and a flock of cranes coming. And I never thought about somebody should be here taking a photograph, but it was like somebody should be here. Not me, but somebody, a real artist.
Tom may not have considered himself a real artist yet, but at the age of 21, he got his first camera. And Professor Johnsgaard was there to help him learn how to use it.
So I never took a picture before 1969. So it wasn't like I grew up with a Brownie or knowing about. But after meeting Paul, I realized that it was a really fun challenge to be able to capture birds in flight. And he said, well, focus on the eyes. This is my only lesson I ever had. Focus on the eyes and shoot it at 500th of a second to stop the wings motion of the birds flying. So I got so good at manually focusing because of all of that. Hundreds of thousands of pictures, but it's all one at a time, and it wasn't 30 frames like we shoot today. But then when autofocus came around, I was pissed off because everybody could shoot. Didn't
have to be so quick with the focus ring anymore.
It took me 25 years to get this down.
I have a strong feeling that you see the world differently through your camera lens, and I want to understand that, and made me think of phrasing it this way, do you think you see the world differently and that makes you an incredible photographer, or does being an incredible photographer make you see the world differently?
No, I think it's the first, seeing the world in different ways makes me a more conscious photographer, maybe, or more creative.
We'll be right back after the break. Tom got his first big break in the photography world when the United States Postal Service came knocking on his door.
And their logo was bald eagles, but they were looking for bald eagles in flight to put over the New York landscape or over the San Francisco Bridge. And they came to me, and I had birds or in focus, eagles, and they bought 2 pictures for $25,000 each. And they were really crappy eagle pictures today.
Wow.
And that in those days, whenever that was, in the 70s or early 80s maybe, there were so few pictures of anything that was flying in focus.
Oh.
So that's how things have changed. Today, those would be just totally throwaway pictures.
But that was something that must have been pivotal, you thinking, okay, I'm good at this, and I've got something that others perhaps don't have. I'm going to make this part of my life. Was that one of the kickoffs to it, when you realized, there's value to this, as well as it's being something that I'm passionate about?
Well, yeah, that because I had no money, basically. Then that made my year's sort of salary in a way. So, of course, Marlboro wanted eagle pictures, but I didn't sell it to them. And I thought I didn't like the idea of promoting smoking. And then later, both my parents and my brother died of cancers of basically smoking or lung cancer. But so I did the right thing. Somebody else sold them the picture, but still I didn't have guilt on my mind. Yeah.
What goes into capturing a memorable wildlife photograph? Is there a lesson in a sentence that Tom Mangelsen can share with the world about, what do you look for when you're taking a photograph? And is there something about capturing one that's memorable? There's
no trick. There's a lot of people will ask me, can you give me your top 3 tips or something? And those early days when I was thinking somebody should paint these pictures, I was looking carefully at compositions and what would make a good picture, not knowing a lot about art. So it's the same thing as any good art has great composition, gesture, light, texture, mood, whatever it might be. My early mentor maybe would be Owen Grommy, who was a master wildlife painter. His son was a friend of mine. He lived in Wisconsin, and we went to visit him, and I just sit there and watch him paint. And I asked him one day, I said, how long does it take you to make it? He was painting some sharp-tailed grouse or prairie chickens in a field of stock. And he was very meticulous, and his compositions were incredible. But I asked him how long it took him to paint a picture, and he laughed at me. He had a little cigar in his mouth, and he looked at me. He's a boy. He was like in his 80s. He said, boy, all my life. And I thought, that's a dumb... That's a silly answer,
That's a fantastic answer.
I know,
but at the time, though, didn't seem like it at the time?
No, it took me, and he just kept painting. Like I had to register what the hell he was talking about. And of course, it was all of his experiences that he's had over his 80-some years went into a painting.
So many analogies there. That's. What about when it comes to photography? Any advice on how to be patient? I know there's a lot of patience comes into this role that you have, and the skills that you have. And sometimes it's just about sitting around waiting, right? Any advice on how to be patient?
Well, like I mentioned, growing up and sitting in duck blinds day after day from sunrise until sunset, day after day, I just thought that's what you do. I mean, I was like, my dad pulled me on our duck decoy boat in a little skiff thing and pulled me across the river, and I was like 3 years old, probably before that actually, but I didn't learn any better. I guess it was just what you do if you want to have a chance at a flock of ducks or geese. And so that was a seminal lesson for me, although I didn't obviously know it until later. But you have to wait. I mean, I don't know how many times people, my assistants or whoever, might say, well, I'll say just another 10 minutes, and well, it'll turn into an hour or an hour and a half. And they just laugh at me.
Yeah.
Wet and cold, and you should have gone in with them. But other times I've waited a bit longer than maybe the next person, and I've got the picture.
And you show them when you get back, look what you should have stayed
yeah,
for.
Exactly. Yeah.
Do you ever leave your camera at home when you go out?
Rarely. No,
Stupid question.
People get frustrated with me, which they don't go along with me much anymore, either their choice or mine. But because they say, can't you just watch? Can't you just observe? And I can. I have observed and watched all my life. Yeah. But I also do like to maybe capture that moment if it happens and not be without a camera. And I've tried it without a camera, and it always makes I usually get angry at myself for not bringing the camera.
And $3.99 when you're out photographing her, it seemed like from the outside, and I didn't spend much time trying to find her, maybe a couple of times in my life, and maybe try and see her. I never did. It was just fleeting little opportunities I had. But
you should have called me sooner. You should have called me.
I know. I missed out. I really missed out. But she was always surrounded by bear groupies and photographers wherever she went, Was there a time in particular that you had her to yourself that stands out?
Well, I had her in the early days. I had her to myself quite often. Then as her popularity grew, as less and less time alone with her. But one time, not that long ago, she was in the river bottom by my house, and my assistant Tiffany and I went down there, and she came, parked herself and her 3 cubs underneath a big spruce tree. The cubs nursed, and they were cubs of the year, so new cubs, and tiny, and just the way they would play on her face or on her head, and then when she had enough of it, she'd sort of move them away, but then she would lick them, and they would be on her back, and then they would sleep for an hour. We were there like 5 hours, was watching her. It wasn't particularly great photographically, but behaviorally, and just that, again, the sentience and the emotional attachment of her and with her cubs. And that I could say I've had it dozens and dozens of times. And when I've been alone or whatever, just watching her behave without anybody else around with her cubs. And it's always pretty much with her cubs, I think. That was the most memorable. But there's a picture of, it's called First Light, where she's crossing the Snake River, and behind her, the sun is just rising on the top of Mount Moran. And my other assistant, Sue, was with me. We've been going up there to photograph elk crossing the river in the fog in the early morning, and I probably went up there 100 times. I do a lot of pre-visualizing, and I'm sure I know you do, and seeing, okay, now I've got the Snake River with the bend. It's bending right towards Mount Moran, and if you park yourself here, and there are trails that are going down here because that's where the shallows are, where the elk cross. So finally, we got some pictures of elk crossing, and then one morning we went up there and we saw 399 when she didn't have cubs. She kicked them out that spring before, and she was dragging a cow elk out of the river. And it was
my goodness!
It was just barely visible, and it was a surprise, a serendipity kind of thing. But again, if you're out there a lot, you get those kinds of surprises. And
what are you doing in that moment when you saw that? That must have been mind blowing.
Well, it was mind blowing, and she pulled it up onto the gravel bar, and then she laid on it, and then she fed on it, and then she pulled it a little bit further and further. And we spent basically, I think, 4 or 5 days by ourselves. There's only one other person. There was a kayak that came by, a yellow kayak, and she stood on the carcass, and he was floating by in his yellow kayak with a mountain in the background. I thought that'd be cool. He was taking pictures with his iPhone. And when he came by, I thought, should I ask him if not to tell anybody? Because if you say don't tell anybody, then of course they're going to tell everybody, right?
Yeah.
Well, I thought I'd take a chance, and I flagged him over, and I said, I've got a great picture of you with the bear and the mountain, and you and your yellow kayak. And I said, I'll send it to you if you want to give me your email. And he's, nah, I don't care.
Wow.
And pretty soon, about an hour later, this guy comes huffing up the river. He said, I heard there's a bear up here. Heard there's a bear up here. Where is it? I said, this is across the river right over there. And then I made him swear to God that he would not tell anybody. So the third day or so, I went up, I met him, and we walked up, and a friend of mine called me that I did tell. A good friend of mine who's always sharing his stuff with me, and he called me on his cell phone, and I was on the phone, and this guy that was with me said, Tom, there's a bear right behind you. And I turned around, and 399 was standing about 10 yards away, just staring at me. She must have been sleeping in the willows.
Really?
But she should not have been on, all things equal. She should have been on the carcass, because she chased every magpie, every raven, every coyote, every eagle. She wouldn't share even a bite with the magpies if she could help it, but she had to go get a drink. So sometimes
the photographs of the magpies flying from the carcass was that day?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, right. I know that picture well. It's incredible, yeah.
Thank you. So she just went up on the hill on the bank and stood up in front of Moran, and I raised my camera, but as soon as I got it to my eye, she went down and she crossed the river. And that became one of my favorite pictures of all time of her. But it was all sort of serendipitous. like
about as intimate as it gets,
Yeah.
right? I had an incredible experience a few years ago in Katmai. There was a female with 3 cubs by us. I had a small group of people that I was taking there to see the bears. And she was very nervous. There were a ton of bears around that day. We could probably see 13 or 15 in eye shot, around us, and some big males. And so she was really nervous. There were Cubs of the Year youngsters. And it was such an honor because I could tell she was quite nervous of us, but less nervous of us than she was of the other bears. And she kind of looked at me, looked at her cubs, looked at me, looked at her cubs, and as if to say, you watch these guys with all these other bears around, I need to go fishing. And there was an understanding from the cubs and us. I swear the cubs looked at me at one point as well, and sort of said, okay, we got this, right? And she lifted her nose to the air like she was smelling the salmon in the river and went straight down to fishing in the river. And I babysat those cubs for a half an hour that she was gone, and it was a benefit to her in some ways with all these marauding males around. It was really interesting. It sounds like there might have been some of that with 399.
Yeah, it was so totally should do that. And yeah, I've been in Katmai, and I've seen that it's really pretty risky for mothers with especially small cubs with males around. I don't call it, like Jane Goodall is a good friend. She said, I don't like people call them boars and sows because those are pigs. And it just dawned on me. I said, I don't like that either. So I never call them boars and sows. They're always either have a name or it's a young male or a female or whatever.
I love hearing that. I'm the same.
Yeah,
definitely. There's the patience. There's the framing of these creatures in photography. There is the landscape versus the close-up. But as well as the patience and all of those other factors, you're also someone who takes action for these bears and you step in to the fray. And I'm just such a huge fan and admirer of that, Tom, because not everybody does and not every photographer does. Sometimes it can be a selfish sport kind of thing, but not in your case. You're a huge advocate for these places that the bears need and for the bears themselves and wildlife all over the world. I mean, tigers, cheetahs, African creatures of all sort, cougars. One recent thing I read about was didn't you get fined for something in the park for around some kind of traffic violation? Do you want to tell that story? It was kind of a twist on standing up for these bears. What happened?
In 2001, I was up on the highway in the east. 399 was feeding on berries in this particular place for a month. They do that every year. So do other bears. And 610 was there, her daughter, and black bear, another grizzly. But at night, I saw them at the edge of the road when she had her quads, the little tiny ones, and they were ready to cross the road. So my assistant, who was driving, Tiffany, she pulled off the road.
They pulled off the road and turned on their hazard lights. They wanted to make sure that any oncoming traffic would be aware that 399 was there, feeding. Just slow down the traffic. This is something Tom says he's done often when he finds a bear near a road, to keep drivers and the bears safe. Shortly after, a park ranger came on the scene.
She said that I was being disrespectful. I said, why? She said, because you're raising your voice. I wasn't raising my voice. I was just worried about 399. It's a terrible highway. It's the same highway that she got hit on, but north. And I'd done many times. I'd seen her or another bears along the road trying to cross, and I would stop at night with my flashlight, usually by myself, and let her go by. But this ranger insisted that we couldn't stop, and she gave me a citation for stopping on the road and for disobeying a lawful order, which she never gave us. And then I went to court, and it was thrown out after almost a year, but it cost me about $20,000.
Oh, my goodness.
For the lawyer fees, plus a lot of heartache and pain in the ass.
I do sense that you would step out in front of traffic to defend these bears, and this is a form of that, And do you view your photography as an act of conservation or protest even?
Well, I think I hope my photographs get people to fall in love or get more knowledgeable, more awareness about animals in general. And therefore, we will hopefully protect them. So number one is I hope my images inspire people to protect what's out there, wilderness or wildlife. I feel that I have to say things that might be controversial when it's what I believe, and I think the bears' interests are not always taken into account by the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Game and Fish Department.
Yeah.
But a lot of people appreciate that. When people come up to me and they say, well, we love your work. We got a couple of your prints. And also we love your conservation message. We love your protection 399 or whatever. And actually, when they say that, it's more important to me than the image that they have, because I know I've changed people. That makes me
Well,
feel, yeah.
That I can imagine how good that feels, and God, it's rightly deserved, Tom. My goodness, I mean, your body of work speaks for itself, and it's way beyond photography. You know, it begs the question. You've seen so much change. You've been photographing for so many decades at this point and seen so much. It's almost like not just the world of photography has changed, but nature has changed, right? Do you feel that the world of nature has changed, or the threats to creatures that you love and photograph has changed over the decades since you started?
You know, when I first started, there were only a couple. You see a National Geographic special. There were 4 then. There wasn't a channel where there's hundreds of movies a week. Jacques Cousteau's, he'd do 4 films a year. So those were like what you looked up to, or I did. And now we have so much social media. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know how many billions of photographs are uploaded every 5 minutes or something around the world. So there's a lot more awareness, but our attention span, especially with young people, as you know, is really short. It's really tough, I think, to draw in new people, especially younger people. Again, attention span is so short, to being eco-warriors or conservationists. But there are some. It's all with the young people now. I mean, people like me, I'm an old dog, and can't probably change my ways. I'm just getting more crotchety.
Not at all. We started this conversation talking about your relationship with 399, and it's probably what you're best known for now. And you know, you've really devoted your life and your career to this incredibly famous bear that we lost, promoting her and protecting her. What's the lesson that you think we should all take away from the story of Grizzly 399?
The lesson, well, we lost an incredible icon of bear world, and you heard the story about the school kids that came from Kansas.
One summer day in Teton National Park, Tom had his camera set up at the side of the road. Tripod, big lens. He was there to photograph 399 when a large bus pulled up alongside. A couple dozen middle school-aged kids poured out. One young boy walked right up to Tom.
He says, "I thought I'd find you on the highway." He said, "I have your book. Would you mind signing it?" I said, "No." He said, ran back to the bus and got his book, and I signed it, and then everybody was clamoring at the spotting scope, with 399 and 2 cubs, about 400 yards, very far away. And the teacher came up and said, "You know, Tom, we've been to Glacier, we've been to Mount Rushmore, we've been to Yellowstone, and now we're here on our way home, and this is the first bears we've seen in our summer trip." And she said, "These kids will remember this moment for the rest of their lives because they doubtfully will see another bear." That really put it in perspective to me, that her best lessons are that she's worth, really, in her kind, are worth protecting for our children and grandchildren and their children over, centuries, hopefully.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, Tom. I know you got a pack for India, for tiger country. What a dull life.
Well, I'll send you a picture.
I promise. I would love that. You can see some of Tom's incredible photographs of Mother Grizzly Bear 399 on our Instagram at The Wild Pod and me at Chris Morgan Wildlife. Shots of the magpies on the carcass that he talked about, and some very cute cubs. Oh, and a picture of Tom as well. Thanks, Tom. Well, folks, as I mentioned earlier, this is the last episode of our season. We could use your help as we make plans for future episodes, so we put a link to a survey in the show notes. Please take a moment to fill it out and tell us what you think of the show. Thank you. And while we're away, now's a great time to check out some of our earlier seasons you may have missed. Penguins, polar bears, mountain lions, woodpeckers, ravens, grizzlies, pythons, sharks, forests, orangutans, ants, jaguars, wolves. There's something for everyone. Just do a search for your favorite place or animal. And maybe tell a friend or two if the moment hits you. Word of mouth is how we spread the word, by mouth. Thanks, everybody. And my thanks to the incredible team of human beings on the Wild team. I love working with you. The Wild is a production of KUOW in Seattle and Chris Morgan Wildlife, with support from Wildlife Media. This show would not be possible without listener support. You can help us continue to create this special immersive storytelling by donating to KUOW. Go to kuow.org/donate/thewild. Thank you. Matt Martin, aka Easy Street, produced this episode. Jim Gates is our editor. The Wild is hosted, produced and written by me, Chris Morgan. A very special thank you for their kind financial support to Jill and Scott Walker, Rose Letwin, Ellen Ferguson, Anna Kimball, John Taylor, Paul Lister, Bob Yellerlees, Barbara Stallman and Barton Brooks. Our production team includes Roy Campanella III, April Craig, Marshall Eisen, Michaela Gianotti-Boyle, Tatiana Latre, Lucy Suchek, Kara McDermott, Amelia Peacock, Darcy Riggin-Schmidt, Brendan Sweeney and Hans Tweit. Our theme music is by Michael Parker. I'm Chris Morgan. Take care of yourselves and keep in touch.